Okay, we're back in Blender, and what we're going to do now is set this all up ready to render out all our different passes, our model, our shadows separate to our floor, so on and so forth. Okay, so to do this, we are just going to come to, we're going to actually move our floor and our lights. We're going to duplicate them to a second layer. So you can see here we've got our layers, these little checkerboards. So if we go to layer 2, look, there's nothing there. Layer 1 there is, because it's denoted by little dots to say it's got content. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come to solid view, and I'm just going to make sure I've got the solid, which is receiving the shadows and the light, and the lamp. So make sure they're both selected. I shift click them both in here. So it's just the floor and the light, nothing else. I'm going to press M to move to a layer. And instead of just shifting them just to 2, so the object's on 1, they're on 2, I'm going to shift click 2. And basically what that does, if I now come down to here, look, on layer 2, there's the solid and the light. And if I come to layer 1, there's the solid, the light, and the object. So if we shift click both of these, they're both on and will be rendered out. Okay? So basically what we've done is duplicated the solid and the light by moving them to layer 2. So now we've got that set up, we can come to our layers window, and we've got the scene layers, which is the 2 we've just set up. But basically we want to render them out. So we're going to create a new render layer. So this is a new render layer. We're going to call this ground, or grund. We're going to make sure it uses both scene layers, but only layer 2, which is our ground and our light. So this layer, and then it's going to exclude layer 1. So basically this is going to render out everything but the shadows and the floor. So there we go. And let's come to render layer 1, and let's make sure that the with this one we're going to render out the object index as well, and this is going to help us render out the mats. Okay. Annoying. Okay. So this is going to help us render out the map index, okay, or the object index, which we're going to use as mats. So we've got render layer 1, which is rendering out the object, the ground, and the light and their interaction. Then we've set up this layer 2, which is going to be used by ground to render out just layer 2, and it's going to exclude layer 1, and that's going to help us control the difference between the 2. And on render layer 1, we've got the object index ticked as well. So let's just come to set up these object indexes. So let's select object 1, come to the object settings, and you should be able to see pass index. We're going to make this 1, so object is going to be on 1. Select the ground, we'll make that 2. So basically this is saying mask out, so we just see the ground. If we use number 1, it's going to mask out just the object. Okay, so now if we just simply press render, and before we do that, let's optimize our render settings. So let's come to the camera. Let's look at a few things that can optimize our render settings. If we just press render now, by default it will render with the standard amount of bounces, the standard amount of light paths, using the CPU, and you see these little tiles. It renders using these tiles, tile by tile, and it will render the render layer, the first render layer, which is our object, the ground, and the lighting, which is render layer 1. Then it'll do the ground as a separate pass, and then it'll combine them all together at the end. So let's just wait for this to come through, and you see it's taking quite a while. We're up to 33, 34, 35 seconds already, and it still hasn't done the first render pass. Okay, let's just wait for this to come through. And if you imagine if you're doing this frame by frame, 24 frames a second for a piece of film, this could take quite a while. So there it is, rendering our shadows, our ground. and our object. And it's looking nice. Nice clean render. The background obviously isn't there yet. We've got to compose that over the top in the compositor. It's now rendering the second, which is this ground layer or grund layer, which is just the ground look. None of the shadows, just the ground. And that's so we can isolate the ground from the shadows from the object. So that's why we set up those render layers the way we did. There we go. Then it combines the two together again. So we can see ground separate to render layer. Okay? But that took quite a while. That took 1 minute 50. So can we speed this up? So let's look at these options. So let's come down to sampling. Now the thing that dictates quality and the lack of noise in there is this sample rate. So we'll leave this at 128, but let's see if we can speed it up. Now at the moment we're using the CPU as our rendering device. But if you've got a dedicated GPU in your computer, if we go to user preferences, go to system, you'll know if you've got one because it'll appear in here, and I've got a GTX 1080. I'm going to tell it to use CUDA cores, press save, close that, and then change it from CPU to GPU compute. Then we can see if this improves the speed. But before we do that, there's an important change. So if we come down to performance, this dictates the size of those little tiles that make up the render. The rule of thumb is if you're doing CPU, you tend to go smaller, and you go in increments of 8, so 64 and then downwards in 8s. The optimum through tests from other people has been that 16 by 16 is a good size for CPU, but for GPU, 256 by 256 is a particularly good one. So we've changed it to GPU, changed these square sizes. It's 1 minute 50 before. Let's see if this speeds up. We haven't changed the sampling. You'll notice those tile sizes are much bigger. It's rendering a whole lot quicker. So it's almost completed the render in 23 seconds. So we've gone from 1 minute 50 to 35 seconds, which can save you a lot of time. We didn't touch the sampling at all. The sampling was left the same. So 35. Let's see if we can speed that up a bit further. So let's come down to light paths, and by default they're very, very high. These are the amount of bouncers that compute all the kind of subtle lighting in here. But again, from tests, people have noticed there's very little difference between 12, say for example, and 2. And 2 tends to be the turning point. So let's go 2, 2 here, 2 here, 2 here, 2 here, 2 here. We haven't got any caustics. And let's see what that does. So it's 35 seconds before. Let's render again. And if you find this is successful, then you can just save this as a preset by pressing plus for your samples, your light paths, sorry. So we've gone down to 30 seconds, bang on. And there's no real difference in the quality of our lighting, our render. So if we want to test the 2, we could go to full global illumination, or sorry, let's go limited. So it brings things back to roughly how they were. So we've gone for the limited preset. I'm going to render that into slot 1. Sorry, slot 2, so we can compare it with slot 1. Let's render again. Render image. So this is still with our larger tile sizes, our GPU compute. We haven't touched the sampling level yet. And this is rendering out both render layers in the space of this time. So you can imagine if you're doing a film, this is suddenly sped up your life from 1 minute 50 right down to 30 seconds, 29 in that regard. Okay. So if we now look at this, let's zoom in, slot 1, no noticeable difference in lighting at all. Slot 1, slot 2, slot 1, slot 2, nothing. So slot 1, 29, fun enough on that. So again, messing around with those. Now, there is still some noise in here with this lower sampling rate. So again, we're going to go in increments of 8, 16, so on and so forth. The preview is 32, which is noisy, so let's render out at 32. I'm going to render this into slot 3 so we can compare it with the others. This should make our rendering times shorter. Wow, so it's going to render this in 13 seconds, but we can see how noisy this is. We compare 3 as it currently is to 2, you can see the noise between 2 and 3. So much faster, you know, it's almost a third of what we had before with 32 samples, but we've got a lot of noise. But again, with this new version of Blender, we've got this denoising option in the layers. So let's tick this. Let's go to render slot 4. So it's still on really low samples, 32. Let's render image. And what this denoising process is going to do is denoise it whilst rendering. So it'll do the render pass and then go through and denoise it. And this should allow us to compare the two, and it doesn't offer that much time difference. And I've just used the denoise at their standard settings as they were left. It's completed at 3025, look. If we compare slot 4, which is denoised, to 3, you can see the difference. Now what would be interesting is to compare slot 4, slot 2. There's not all that much difference. In fact, slot 2 looks noisier than slot 4. Slot 1, slot 4. The denoised option looks better. So again, because this is a still, what I'll be tempted to do before we go on to the next video is come back to our sampling. I'm going to go for 1. That's, if you're not quite sure of an increment, so let's times that by 4. So press the star key, then 4. 128 samples, which we had, but keep denoising on. We should get a nice clean image. Now let's just go. We've got a bit of time. Let's say we've got a minute. Let's render the image. And let's see what results we get. So that's how to optimize your render settings to get the best possible render in the least amount of time. So GPU compute, making sure your tile sizes match your computation methods. If your CPU smaller, if it's GPU larger, minimizing your light paths because they're wasted, and then using the new denoising system alongside samples to kind of minimize your time. Remember that first CPU render we did was 1 minute 50 for half the amount of samples we have here. We'll see this might come out about the same, but we've doubled the amount of samples and we've got a denoising process over the top. And you can see some people having crazy amount of samples to render things like in the thousands. But in fact, with this new denoising feature and some of these limited things you do not need, and we're down to about 1 minute 15, which is still much quicker than we had. So if we go to slot 1, noisy, Slot 4 now. Nice and clean. Okay. So there we go. That's how to optimize your render settings. So if you've got a bit more time, up the sampling, but keep everything else as it was. So I'm going to times this by 2 a bit more. 512. Still relatively low. I'm going to save it and leave it rendering, and I'll come back in the next video. Thank you.